The icy midday wind cut like a knife. Trace Calder was dragging his cart loaded with firewood down the snow-covered road, feeling the weight of every log in his tired arms. The mountains around him shone white under the winter sun. Beautiful, but merciless. He had left his ranch at dawn, and now, 3 hours later, had barely made it halfway back. His numb hands forced him to stop. He needed warmth, even just for a few minutes. With the precision born of years on the frontier, he gathered dry branches poking through the snow, struck his flint, and in minutes had a small fire crackling. Smoke rose straight into the clear sky. Trace held his hands out over the flames, sighing in relief as he prepared coffee in his old dented tin. That's when he saw them. 4 small figures moving slowly among the trees, about 100 yards away. He squinted. A woman and 3 children were walking with difficulty, sinking into the snow with each step. Even from that distance, he could see they were trembling. The woman stopped, staring toward the smoke from his fire. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, she took her children by the hands and began walking toward him. Trace didn't move. He just waited, watching. As they drew closer, he could see more details. The woman wore worn, patched, traditional Apache clothing. Her children, 2 girls and a boy, had thin faces and wide eyes. The smallest, who looked no older than 5, was limping. The woman stopped a few steps from the fire. Her black eyes studied Trace carefully, assessing danger. He could see the battle on her face. Pride against need, fear against desperation. At last, she spoke in a clear voice, though her accent was strong. "Can we warm ourselves?" 3 simple words. 3 words that changed everything. Trace looked at the children's faces. Purple lips, stiff fingers. The little one was crying silently, frozen tears on his cheeks. He remembered another winter, years ago, when he himself had been lost in the snow. An old trapper had saved him, sharing his fire without asking questions. "The fire belongs to everyone," Trace replied, stepping aside. "Come, sit down." The woman hesitated only a moment before leading her children toward the warmth. They all sat close together, huddled, reaching out their hands to the flames. Trace poured hot coffee into his only cup and offered it to the woman. She shook her head and passed it to the eldest boy, who drank with trembling hands. "Name's Trace Calder," he said, pulling dry bread from his satchel and breaking it into pieces. He offered them the food. This time the woman didn't refuse. "Rhea," she answered simply, watching her children devour the bread. Rhea Redfeather. For several minutes, no one spoke. Only the fires crackle, the winds whistle through the pines, and the children's chewing filled the silence. Trace added more wood, making the flames rise. Color began to return to the small faces. "Where are you headed?" he finally asked. Rhea looked south, toward the distant mountains. To find family. Tribe. Trace followed her gaze. He knew those mountains. The journey would take days, maybe weeks, especially with children. And the sky, though clear for now, held that milky tone on the horizon he knew too well. "It's going to snow," he said, pointing to the clouds gathering in the distance. "A lot." Rhea nodded. She already knew. But moving forward was her only choice. The youngest girl, Naya, curled against her mother, finally stopping her shivering. The middle one, Tiva, looked at Trace with curiosity, unafraid. The eldest, Tassa, kept his eyes low, trying to disappear. Trace offered more bread. This time Rhea took a piece too, though only a small bite. A mother, Trace thought, always giving to her children first. The fire burned strong now, creating a small circle of warmth in the vast, frozen land. In that moment, in that place, two worlds met: a lone cowboy and an Apache mother with her children. Strangers brought together by the most basic need: survival. Neither of them knew that this meeting by the fire would change their lives forever. That the simple question, "Can we warm ourselves?" was the beginning of something greater than either could imagine. As the sun began to dip and the storm clouds crept slowly over the mountains, Trace made a decision. "My ranch is 2 hours from here," he said. "Stay the night. In the morning when the sun's up, you can go on your way." Rhea looked him in the eyes, searching for deceit, searching for danger. All she found was exhaustion. And something else: understanding. She nodded slowly. And so, as the first clouds covered the sun and the temperature began to drop, 5 people set off toward an uncertain destination. Dawn brought no hope, only a thicker silence and a white light that covered everything, as if the whole world had been swallowed by snow. Trace Calder rose from the kitchen floor with a numb body and joints that creaked in protest. He had slept beside the fire, a blanket around his shoulders, while the wind battered the roof logs. He stretched slowly, careful not to make a sound. No noise came from the guest room. Rhea Redfeather and her 3 children were still asleep, worn out from days of walking and nights without shelter. Trace added wood to the fire and made coffee. The scent filled the cabin. Strong, warm, honest. He looked out the window. The clouds from the day before had cleared, but to the west, a dirty gray line had begun to rise. And it wasn't a good sign. He knew those clouds. They didn't bring a light snowfall. They brought lockdown. An hour later, he heard soft footsteps. Rhea appeared in the kitchen doorway with Tassa asleep in her arms. Her face was tight, like someone aware they didn't belong. But her eyes, still proud, also held something else. Silent acknowledgement. "Good morning," said Trace, not looking directly at her. "The coffee's hot." She nodded. She set the boy in a chair near the fire, tucking him in carefully. Tiva and Naya arrived next, still half asleep, bare feet on the wooden floor. No one said a word. They ate in silence. Bread, coffee, butter. Trace watched without seeming to. Rhea barely touched her bread. She broke it into small pieces and passed them to the children. Just like the night before. Like the mother she was. When they finished, she stood with her shoulders straight. Her voice was clear, almost sharp. "We must leave. We've stayed long enough." Trace didn't answer right away. He stood, crossed the kitchen, looked out the window again. "There's a big one coming," he said. "You could wait one more day." "Thank you," Rhea replied. "But no." There was a firmness in her voice that left no room for sympathy. It wasn't stubbornness. It was history. Her people had always left before anyone could tell them they weren't welcome. Trace nodded. He didn't argue. He helped gather supplies: bread, dried meat, an extra blanket he left on the table. Rhea accepted everything without a single sign of weakness. That was her way of saying thank you. When they stepped outside, the wind hit them like a whip. Trace watched from the porch. 4 small, thin figures moving south, leaving tracks already starting to vanish. He went back inside. Sat down. Rubbed his face. Tried to think about something else. Tried to work. But he couldn't. He spent the morning repairing a harness, sharpening blades, fixing a door that didn't need fixing, and looking out the window. By midday, the world began to disappear. The first flakes fell slowly, white, harmless. Then they swarmed. The wind shifted. The sky closed in. Trace went out to the shed for more wood. When he returned, he could no longer see the barn. The storm wasn't a threat anymore. It was a certainty. And then came a knock at the door. Not a hard knock. Not loud. A brush. Barely a plea against the wood. He opened it without thinking. Rhea stood there, soaked, her hair crusted with frost. Tiva was shivering behind her. Naya was crying. Tassa hung limp, like a sack without strength. "We couldn't," she said through clenched teeth. "Everything. White, I'm sorry." Trace didn't answer. He simply opened the door wider. "Come in. Now." He helped them remove their wet coats, wrapped them in blankets, placed hot cups in their hands. Rhea tried to apologize again. He shook his head. "Not now. Get warm first." Outside, the storm roared. Snow pounded the roof. The house creaked like a ship lost in a sea of white. But inside, in front of the fire, 4 bodies came back to life. And one look, hers, crossed the space between them, carrying a mix of shame and surrender. They hadn't come back for comfort. They'd come back out of need. And that, in land like this, changed everything. The storm didn't stop all night. The wind shook the wooden walls like it meant to tear them off at the roots, and the snow tapped against the windows like impatient fingers. Inside, the fire held strong, and around it, 4 bodies searched for warmth. And one, Rhea Redfeathers, was searching for something more, a place that didn't hurt. Trace Calder barely slept. He moved back and forth from the hearth, checking to make sure the flames didn't die down. He knew it wasn't the cold that wore people down the most. It was the feeling of being an uninvited guest. The house had become a kind of truce. At dawn, light came in pale and shapeless. Everything outside was white, and inside, the air was thick with silence. But not the peaceful kind. It was the kind of silence made of unspoken words, of shame that builds like frost on your shoulders. Rhea kept her distance, seated in a corner with the children. She ate little, slept less, and when she walked through the house, it was as if each step might break something. Trace said nothing. He just watched. He knew that kind of pride, the kind that doesn't raise its voice but builds walls instead. That first morning, he made breakfast and left the plates on the table without looking at Rhea. Then he stepped out, pulled his hat low, and walked into the blizzard to fetch more wood from the shed. When he returned, the scene had changed. Rhea wasn't sitting anymore. She was standing, right in front of the table, and in her hands, she held a needle. On the table he had left, without a word, without explanation, a pile of clothes, pants with holes, shirts missing buttons, socks with worn-out heels. Things he'd stored for months, never mended, things that now spoke louder than any offer. Rhea had understood, and she had accepted. No words were exchanged. Trace dropped the wood, shrugged off his damp coat, and began making coffee. From that moment, something invisible shifted. They were no longer just a family seeking shelter and a quiet cowboy. They were 2 people sharing the work, each in their own way. The children, without realizing it, began to fill the house. Tassa, the youngest, discovered an old toolbox that Trace kept in the back room. He spent hours with it, touching the hammers, trying to figure out what each thing was for. He had that clean kind of curiosity that only children who've suffered deeply somehow manage to keep. Naya and Tiva were becoming more comfortable by the day. They played with carved wooden scraps, made up stories in whispers, and sometimes they even laughed. Trace heard those giggles from the barn, and though he didn't say a word, something inside him, something that had lain dormant for years, began to stir. A small crack in the stillness. That night, after the children were asleep, bundled beside the fire, Rhea lifted her gaze from the clothes she was still mending and finally broke the ice. "Thank you," she said, nothing more. Trace looked at her. "You don't have to." "Yes," she insisted. "We could be out there." Silence returned, but it was no longer tense. It was rest. Trace drank from his cup. The coffee was cold, but he didn't mind. "You don't ask much," Rhea said, offering a tired half-smile. He shrugged. "The important things are already said, by your feet, your hunger, and your eyes." Rhea lowered her gaze. She seemed less guarded. Not defeated, not broken, just tired of holding up the wall for too long. "My husband disappeared 6 moons ago," she confessed. "He went out to hunt, never came back." She didn't need to say more. Trace didn't ask. Because he, too, had loved and lost. Because he knew someone else's pain didn't always need to be touched. "The tribe doesn't have enough this winter," she went on. "Too many mouths. I thought I could find my mother's kin in the south, but we didn't make it." Trace nodded. "You made it here. Your children are alive. They're warm. That's what matters." She looked at him like she wasn't sure what to do with those words. "Do you have family?" Trace took a moment to answer. "I did. A wife, a boy. Fever took them. 5 winters ago." Rhea said nothing, but something changed in her expression. Something that hadn't been there before. Mutual respect, one equal to another. "Tomorrow," she said at last, "I'll make bread from my people, to give thanks." Trace smiled to himself. He didn't let it show all the way. "I'd like that." And that night, for the first time in a long while, they didn't feel so alone. The cold was still there, clinging to the walls, to the floor, to the bones. But that morning, in the ranch kitchen, the air smelled different. There was fire, yes, but also toasted corn, warm flour, and something else. Something without a name. Rhea Redfeather had been working in silence for hours. She kneaded at the wooden table with slow, steady movements. The children were still asleep, bundled by the hearth, worn out from the storm the day before. And Trace Calder, from the window, watched her out of the corner of his eye as he split kindling. "What are you making?" he finally asked, voice low. Rhea didn't turn. "Apache bread, with what we've got." No further explanation came. None was needed. Trace nodded and went back to his task. Outside, the sky stayed overcast, but the snow had let up. Inside, the ranch had found another rhythm. When the bread was ready, they broke it and shared it. It was flat, dark, carrying the deep taste of corn and smoke. The children ate in silence, without rushing. Rhea did too. For the first time since she'd arrived, she ate without looking at the others first. Trace noticed the change. He said nothing, but he held on to it, like one keeps a promise. That day felt longer than most. Not because of the chores, they were few, the storm still kept them in, but because of how slowly thoughts moved. In the afternoon, while the children played with wood scraps in the corner, Rhea sat by the fire and returned to her mending. Trace, with a length of rope in hand, worked at repairing an old lasso. "What was your son's name?" Rhea asked, not looking up. Trace didn't answer right away. He set the rope aside. "Evan." "He was 7 years old." Rhea nodded. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She didn't have to. "My mother died when I was 6, she said. "My father never spoke of her again. He only sang a very old song when he thought we were asleep." Rhea's voice cracked slightly at the end. Trace didn't take his eyes off the fire. The embers flickered like eyes that refused to close. "I dug their graves," Trace said after a while. "Side by side. The ground was so hard I broke the shovel. Silence. Thick. Raw. Real. That first winter was the worst. Everything looked the same. Except me. Rhea let the needle drop into the basket. She took a deep breath. I changed too, but I didn't have time to stop. With children, you just keep going. Trace nodded. And keep going. And going. Until one day you realize you don't know where you're headed. Only that you're still alive. A spark jumped from the firewood. Tassa stirred in his sleep. Naya mumbled something and rolled over. Tiva was still awake, staring at the ceiling as if reading stars that were no longer there. What did you see in me to open that door? Rhea asked, voice low. Trace turned his head. I saw someone who asked for nothing, and I saw the children, and I remembered what a child really looks like when they're cold. Rhea pressed her lips together. She stood, covered Tassa with a blanket. And now what? She asked without looking at him. Now you're here, and the snow won't be gone by tomorrow? She nodded. Then, tomorrow I'll clean out the shed, if you lend me a broom. Trace let out a short laugh. If you find one without nails in it, it's all yours. And that night, when silence returned to the house, it no longer hurt. It was a silence full of embers, slow but not dead, like fresh bread, broken by hands that have lost much, but still know how to hold. The sky was clear at dawn for the first time in days. The clouds had retreated like animals that had eaten their fill, leaving behind a white land, quiet and gleaming. Trace Calder's ranch breathed again, but not completely. It was still winter, and in the west, nothing good lasts long. The snow crunched beneath their boots. Rhea Redfeather swept the porch with energy, as if every frost were a debt owed. The children ran back and forth between the house and the barn, laughing at small things. A piece of rope, a frozen footprint, a sliver of sunlight on the roof. Tassa, the little one, followed Trace everywhere. He didn't speak much, but his eyes said everything. Admiration, curiosity, and that silent question orphans ask without knowing it. Are you going to stay? Trace didn't answer with words, but he let him ride the horse. He taught him how to tie the right knot, showed him how to clean a saddle without cracking the leather. Tiva helped Rhea with chores. Naya played with a doll made from scraps. Rhea had sewn it together from old shirt remnants. The house, without meaning to, had started to feel like something alive again. By mid-morning, Rhea had a large pot simmering with corn, beans, and herbs. The smell filled the kitchen. It was thick, earthy, like a song one had forgotten, but still somehow recognized. Trace watched her from the doorway. Does it smell like your home? He asked, not meaning to sound soft. Rhea nodded without looking at him. Like the one before, yes. They all ate together. It wasn't a fancy table, but it was a real one. And that, in times like these, meant a great deal. After the meal, Rhea was gathering the bowls when she noticed it. She froze, stood still, shoulders tight. Trace, who was sharpening a tool, looked up. What is it? She didn't answer. She walked to the window and barely pulled back the curtain. There, she murmured. On the hill. Smoke. Trace stepped closer. He frowned. That's Creed Voss's land. He doesn't usually light a fire at this hour. The air shifted. Not in temperature, in tone. The children kept playing, unaware. But the adults went on alert. Do you think someone said something? Rhea whispered. Trace didn't respond. He knew smoke out here was like a signal. When you saw it, it was already too late to ask. You just waited. Don't go out alone, he told her. You or the children. She nodded. Not in fear, but with the tension of someone who's been watched too many times in her life. By afternoon, everything seemed normal again, but it wasn't. Rhea sewed faster. Trace loaded the shotgun. He didn't say a word, just cleaned it calmly and placed it behind the door. The children sensed the change in the air. They didn't cry, but they stayed closer to their mother. Tiva especially kept glancing toward the window. That night, the fire didn't go out. Trace left enough wood to keep it going until morning. And though no one said it out loud, everyone slept with their boots nearby. Before closing her eyes, Rhea stepped to the threshold. Do you think they'll come? Trace didn't answer right away. If they do, it'll be soon. She nodded. Thank you for not asking more. Thank you for not asking permission to stay, he said without turning around. The words dropped like a stone into water. No echo, but heavy. And so, while melted snow dripped from the roof, somewhere out on that western hill, someone already knew too much. The truce had been short. Now, the questions were coming, and on the frontier, every question carries a threat. The afternoon seemed calm, but Trace knew the kind of calm that doesn't creak is the one that lies the most. The snow had stopped falling, and the sun peeked shyly through the clouds, melting the edges of the roof. But it wasn't the sky that unsettled him. It was the knock at the door. Just one. Sharp. Not rushed, but firm enough to make Rhea drop the cup in her hands. Tassa ran to hide behind the wood stove. Tiva froze. Naya clung to her mother's arm without saying a word. Trace stood up slowly. He grabbed the shotgun, not in a rush, but with the ease of someone who'd done it before. He walked toward the door and looked through the crack. It's Creed Voss, he said quietly. Rhea tensed. Is he alone? For now. He opened the door without stepping fully away from it. Creed, he greeted with a minimal nod. The man on the threshold wasn't smiling. His coat was stained with mud, gloves still on, and his face carried the kind of look that usually came with bad news. Trace, he nodded. Can we talk? Trace stepped out onto the porch, closed the door behind him. The two men stood there, not moving, not touching. Two men who weren't friends, but owed each other a certain respect. Word is you've got company, Creed said, glancing toward the horses tied in the shade. That's right, Trace replied, no frills. Folk from down south? An Apache woman and her children. The silence that followed was thick. Creed rubbed his gloved fingers together, like trying to wipe off something dirty. Except it was inside. You know folks in town won't take kindly to that. I never cared what folks liked or didn't, said Trace, but I care about the cold, the hunger, and 3 kids with blue feet. Creed took a deep breath, looked at the sky, then the ground, and finally into Trace's eyes. I'm telling you because it falls on me, not because I want to. Voices are starting to rise, and when that happens, you don't quiet them back down. Threats? Warnings. Some say they're staying, that you're hiding them, that if something happens next, it'll be on you. Trace nodded slowly. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He just held Creed's gaze until the man dropped his own. You've always been stubborn, Calder, Creed said at last. But times are changing, and some folks' patience doesn't last as long as yours. Trace clenched his jaw. Then tell them if they've got something to say, they can say it to my face, and if not, they best shut their mouths and tend to their own windows. Creed didn't answer. He turned halfway, mounted his horse, and rode off without looking back. Trace waited until he vanished among the pines. Then he stepped back inside. Rhea was standing tall, the children behind her like branches clinging to the trunk. "They know now," he said. "Are we leaving at dawn?" she asked. Trace looked at her like he hadn't understood the question. "And where exactly do you plan to go? With 3 little ones and another storm coming?" "I don't want to bring you trouble." "Rhea, the trouble's already here. But if you leave now, it'll feel like I pushed you out. And I'm not doing that." She lowered her eyes. Tiva took a deeper breath. Naya rested her head on her mother's lap. Tassa peeked out with just half his face. "Then," Rhea said softly, "we're staying." "We're staying," Trace confirmed, "and let them say whatever they want." That night the fire crackled again like water over stone. The house was quiet, but it was no longer a silence of fear. It was the silence of someone who knows the calm has been broken, and that now it's time to hold on to what matters, even if the wind comes, even if the whole town does. For 3 days, the town stayed quiet. No riders came. No gunshots rang out. Not a single knock on the door. Only snow melting slowly under a lukewarm sun, as if the land itself wanted to pretend nothing had happened. But Trace Calder wasn't the kind of man fooled by calm. Each morning he checked the tree line. Each night he made sure the door bolt slid in just right. And still, inside the ranch, life was breathing. Tassa followed him like a loyal pup. He no longer walked in hiding or kept his eyes down. He helped with tools, handed him nails, watched him mend a fence like it was magic. And Trace, who never imagined having anyone small around again, found himself teaching things he barely remembered knowing. Naya, with her soft voice, braided little cords from hemp thread she found around the house. One day, without saying a word, she left one on the table for Trace. He didn't know what to do with it. So he tied it to the window latch. And there it stayed. Tiva didn't talk much, but she saw everything. Rhea trusted her with small tasks, measuring out the flour, checking the blankets. The girl was growing fast, the way kids do when they haven't had a choice. In the afternoons, the ranch carried a sound no family can fake, the uneven patter of bare feet, spoons hitting pots, sudden laughter. A home. Rhea went out to cut dry branches with a knife Trace had sharpened for her, without a word. She didn't ask for help, and he didn't offer unless she'd earned it. One afternoon, while they worked on the water trough, Trace broke the silence. "The little one, Tassa, does he ask about his father?" Rhea Redfeather looked up, her forehead beaded with sweat. "Sometimes. I tell him his father's strong, that he's walking the other way, and that one day, if he wants, he can catch up to him." Trace nodded. "That's a good answer." "And you?" she asked suddenly. "Did you tell yours about your family?" Trace dropped his gaze. His hands trembled, just barely. He fixed his eyes on the wood like searching for something that wasn't there anymore. "No. Only once. When I buried them." Rhea didn't reply, but she stood beside him a moment longer than needed. That night, the ranch smelled like stew, like clothes drying, like shared silence. After dinner, Tiva sat beside Trace with a serious expression. "Can I help you with something tomorrow?" He looked at her, surprised, nodded slowly. "Sure, you can help me clean out the old chicken shed." She smiled. Not much, just enough for childhood to show in her eyes. And then, without warning, like a storm in reverse, Rhea stepped forward with a hot cup in her hands. "Thank you," she said to Trace, her voice steady. "For not asking more than you can carry?" Trace looked at her with a calm that came from far off. "Thank you," he replied, "for not asking for what you can't return." And in that moment, they both understood something, without needing to say it. Neither of them had come here looking for comfort. But maybe, without looking for it, they were building it. Outside, the trees dripped, the snow pulled back. And even though deep down they knew nothing was truly settled, that night the fire kept burning, without anyone watching it. That morning, the air carried something different. It wasn't the cold, or the wind. It was that thick kind of silence that shows up when someone's coming with intent. Trace Calder felt it before he heard it. He was in the barn, cleaning out the feed bins, when the hoofbeats echoed through the trees. 4 riders. Slow steps. Steady. They weren't in a hurry, but they had purpose. From the window, Rhea Redfeather saw them too. She didn't yell. She just set the broom down, called the children in without raising her voice. She told them to go into the pantry and stay there. Tiva closed the door from the inside. Trace stepped out onto the porch. The shotgun rested against the wall, but he didn't reach for it. The men dismounted one by one. Creed Voss at the front. Beside him, Hank Dobbs, Dusty Maris, and Roe Carter. Men from town. Men of hard land and fixed opinions. "Trace," said Creed, not taking off his hat. "We didn't come to harm you." "But you came armed," Trace replied, glancing at the rifles strapped to their saddles. "Precaution," said Hank. "You never know with their kind." Trace didn't answer. Rhea had come out and stood beside him, tall, her face calm. She wasn't looking for a fight, but she wasn't about to bow her head either. Creed spoke. "People are starting to talk, at church, at the saloon, at the store, that you've got Apaches in your home, that you're hiding them, that you're betraying your blood." "My blood doesn't carry a flag," Trace said calmly. "And if these folks have names and faces, they're not enemies," Dusty scoffed. "And what happens when their kin come for more? When one of them steals a cow or a little girl?" Rhea's eyes locked on him, not with hate, but with a dignity that stung. "My children don't steal," she said, "and I'm not the kind who hides. If you came to drive us out, say it, but don't spit fear and call it law." No one spoke. The wind rustled the branches. The sun caught the dust on their coats, and the space between the ranch and the world grew wider. "No one came to drive anyone out," said Creed. "But you have to understand, Trace, this changes things. People don't trust anymore. And in the West, without trust, everything rots." Trace lowered his eyes for a second, then lifted them like a man who's made up his mind and won't go back on it. "If that's what you're worried about, let me be clear. This family stays, and whoever doesn't understand that shouldn't come to my door." Creed took off his hat, not out of respect, but because there was nothing left to say. "I figured you'd choose this way." "I didn't choose anything. I just opened a door, and it seemed fairer to leave it open than to slam it in the faces of children." No one replied. The men climbed back on their horses. They rode out the same way they'd come. They didn't threaten. They didn't demand. But they left behind a silence heavier than snow. Rhea looked at Trace. She didn't say, "Thank you." She didn't have to. "And now?" she asked softly. "Now, we get ready. Not to run, to stand." That night the ranch was calm, but it was a tense calm, the kind that comes right before a storm. The fire burned, the children slept, and Rhea, for the first time, allowed herself to sit without watching the door. Trace was sharpening the shovel, not the shotgun. The shovel. Because if something had to be planted or buried, he wanted to be ready. Morning broke differently, not because of the weather, which was still just as cold, but because of the way Trace Calder set his hat on his head. With purpose, without hesitation. Rhea Redfeather watched from the window while making coffee. She noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way he fastened the belt buckle, the silence thicker than usual. "You going into town?" she asked plainly. "Yeah," he said. "Need to buy salt, tinder, and let 'em see me." She nodded. No need for more explanation. She understood that in these parts, sometimes saying nothing is the same as letting others decide for you. "Want me to go with you?" Trace paused for a second. Not because he hadn't thought about it, but because he didn't want her to take it as a gesture of protection. "No, not yet, but the day will come." He rode out without another word, and disappeared down the path, leaving behind a trail of pressed snow the wind soon erased. The town store was half empty. Only the shopkeeper, Elias Boone, and a couple of men pretending to look at sacks were there. But really, they were waiting for Trace. The cowboy walked in with a steady step, dropped his list on the counter, asked for what he needed. Elias looked at him cautiously. "Anything else?" Trace met his gaze. "Yeah. Rhea Redfeather's gonna start selling herbs and remedies here. I'll stand behind the quality and the payment." One of the men in the back snorted. "So now you're running trade with the savages?" Trace turned. "Trade's not the word. Working together, earning, building something, that is." The other man cleared his throat. "That's not what folks are saying." "I don't care what folks are saying," Trace replied, voice sharp. "I care about what's being done, and she cooks, heals, raises her kids owing no one a damn thing. That's more than I can say for some in here." No one replied. The silence that followed was tight like a pulled rope. But Trace didn't flinch, didn't lower his voice, didn't explain any further. After a moment, Elias packed the goods into a sack. "You'll have your order in 2 days," Trace nodded, paid, and left. There were no insults, no shoving. But when he got back to the ranch, Rhea already knew everything. "Did they look at you?" she asked. "Yeah." "Did they say anything?" "Yeah." "And now?" Trace set the bags on the table, sat down, coat still on. "Now they know. If they touch you, they're touching me." Rhea swallowed hard. The children from the corner watched without fully understanding. But Tiva sensed it. Naya set her doll aside. Tassa came forward and handed Trace a small braided cord. "So you won't forget." Trace tied it around his wrist. He didn't say a word. Just looked at Rhea like a man who no longer questioned why he was where he was. She stepped closer. "Thank you," she said. "But this is gonna cost you." "It already does. But living without doing it would cost more." The afternoon fell with a gentle light, as if winter too needed a truce. And for the first time, the ranch didn't feel like a shelter. It felt like a place chosen. The snow was gone. Not all at once, but with that slowness that comes with things that hurt. Mud returned to the trails. The trees shook the white off their shoulders, and the wind, though still blowing, was no longer the same. At Trace Calder's ranch, routine had become a companion. Not like before, dry, hollow, mechanical, but with the shape days take when they're shared. Rhea Redfeather cooked without looking out the window. The children spoke in loud voices. And Trace no longer kept the shotgun by the door. There were no more visits, no warnings, but no apologies either. Just a rumor that faded in town, like a fire running out of wood. Maybe out of respect, maybe out of fear, or maybe just because winter had brought other urgencies. One afternoon, Trace was fixing the fence with Tiva, while Tassa dug a hole where one wasn't needed. Naya was braiding hemp thread near the well. Rhea stepped out onto the porch with a basket of clean clothes, and for a moment, everything felt simple. "How's it look?" she asked, without raising her voice. "Solid," he answered, meaning the fence. But not only the fence. "Do you think this could last?" Trace set the hammer down on the post, wiped his hands on a rag, looked at the children, looked at the house. "I don't know, but while it lasts, it's ours." That night there were no words, just embers, warm bread, and a neighbor's dog barking in the distance. Rhea served a broth steeped with herbs. Trace accepted it without saying thank you. She wasn't expecting to hear it. After supper, Tiva lit the oil lamp. Tassa asked Trace to tell him how he broke his first horse. And Naya fell asleep on the patchwork fur rug Rhea had stitched together from old scraps. The ranch wasn't rich, or big, or safe, but for the first time, it was home. Before bed, Rhea stepped out onto the porch. The sky was clear. The stars felt closer. Trace followed with a blanket. "Do you regret it?" she asked. He shook his head. No, what hurt was being alone and not knowing why. She nodded. "What hurt for me was walking, not knowing where to go." They looked at each other, not with promises, but with certainty. "Thank you for not closing the door," she said. Trace offered the faintest smile. "Thank you for knocking." And there, in the cold, open country, between two people marked by loss, something was born. Something without a name, but with roots. The frontier didn't disappear, nor did the suspicion, nor the past. But something shifted, because sometimes it's enough not to close the door. It's enough to meet someone's gaze. It's enough to choose to stay, no matter the cost. And when the wind starts to blow again, if the fire's still lit, if the children are still laughing, if someone asks whether you need more wood, then maybe, just maybe, that's enough. And you, if someone knocked on your door on a snowy night, with 3 half-frozen children and eyes full of history, would you open it, or would you guard what little you have left? If this story moved you, we invite you to join us in uncovering more true stories from the Old West, stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit God placed in those who paved the way. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and ride with us once more through this untamed land. Thank you.